Hello everyone, welcome to the Kommander MTG YouTube channel. My name is Jason Com, and I'm here to help you find your way into the Kommander format. And today we have a budget build with Tatyova Benthic Druid as our commander that totals under $35 after taxes and shipping. This deck is specifically built with new players in mind. Two of the most fundamental aspects of Commander gameplay is card draw and ramp. Without both of these in some capacity, you're likely not going to enjoy playing your deck very much. But lucky for you, I have a deck built here with a commander that incentivizes us to play lands and draw numerous cards in the process. Tatyova Benthic Druid is a 5-mana, 3-colorless blue-green, 3/3 legendary creature, Merfolk Druid, that has the ability, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and draw a card. This deck is built with a ton of ramp spells and creatures that help get our commander out early so we can take advantage of her trigger and drown our opponents in card advantage. First, we're going to go over ramp. Now, since our commander triggers from lands coming into play, we're going to lean hard on spells and creatures that do this. Creatures like Arboreal Grazer lets us put another land from our hand into play when it enters the battlefield. And creatures like Llanowar Scout, Sky Shroud Ranger, and Walking Atlas let us repeatedly do this by tapping them. Tap, gain 1 life, and draw a card is an amazing deal once our commander is in play. The beauty of these cards is they accomplish 3 things. First, they let us get our commander out early by putting additional lands into play. Second, once she is in play, we can abuse these cards and take advantage of her amazing trigger. And third, they're great bodies to have in the early game to thwart aggressive decks. Lastly, we have creatures like Coiling Oracle that can get us another land into play or simply another card in hand. And Yavimaya Elder that has a great trigger upon dying that lets you search your library for 2 basic lands, put them into your hand, or you can sacrifice it for 2 colorless mana to also draw a card. Apart from creatures, this deck is full of spells that will help us power out lands and keep the card draw train rolling. Commander classics like Cultivate, Harrow, and Rampant Growth let us simply put more lands into play and slot into this deck nicely. Now these next 3 have some slight limitations tacked onto them, and if we can meet these expectations, the payoff can be huge. Take Far Wanderings for example. It's a 3-mana spell that lets us search our library for a basic land and put it into play tapped. That's not that great, but if we meet the threshold requirement of 7 or more cards in our graveyard, then we get to search for and play 3 lands instead. 3 mana for 3 lands is amazing, and with Tatyova out, we could potentially spend 3 mana, put 3 lands into play, gain 3 life, and draw 3 cards. That sounds broken. Next is Grow from Ashes, a sorcery that lets us search our library for land to put into play untapped this time, except it has an alternative kicker cost for 2, meaning if we pay 3 mana for Grow from the Ashes, plus another 2 mana to pay the kicker cost, then we can get 2 lands into play untapped. We basically get a 2 mana refund that we can use on other spells. It's not too bad. And next is Journey of Discovery, another 3 mana sorcery that lets you choose one, either search your library for 2 basic lands and put them into your hand, or you may play 2 additional lands this turn. However, for just 3 more mana, we can pay its entwine cost, meaning we don't have to choose and we get both abilities. Now with all 3 of these cards, there is a downside of drawing them too early to benefit from them, but even without getting the full value, they're perfect for our game plan. Now these next 2 ramp cards are a little fun. Beanstalk Giant is a 7-mana creature whose power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. Can you imagine how big this guy is going to get in this deck? I mean, I'm thinking a 7-mana 15/15 easy. Also, Beanstalk Giant has an adventure ability called Fertile Footsteps, a 3-mana sorcery that lets you search your library for a basic land and put it into play. It's a great card for the early game where you can simply ramp, or you'll have a beater late game that can threaten life totals. Our last ramp card is Kamal's Druidic Vow, a 2 green mana X spell that can only be cast if you control a legendary creature or planeswalker, aka Tatyova. You look at the top X cards of your library and put any number of land and or legendary permanent cards with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest into your graveyard. Can you imagine in a deck like this where you'll commonly have 10 plus mana by turn 6, how many lands this is going to get into play? Not to mention there's over 40 lands in the deck. Now don't get me wrong, you can dump 12 mana into the spell and only get a couple of lands, but you could also put 6+ lands into play in one turn. Your opponents might as well scoop and go on to the next game because you'd have that game in the bag. Next, we're going to go over some card draw. Now, since our commander lets us draw a card for each land we play, which there are 41 of them in this deck, by the way, card draw mechanics outside this are going to be minimal. The first two are commander staples. Fact or Fiction is a 4-mana instant that reveals the top 5 cards of your library, has an opponent split them into 2 piles for you to choose from. Most often this will result with you getting 3 cards, and since all of our lands also draws cards with Tatyova, we're almost always going to come out on top with a favorable option. The other is Treasure Cruise, an 8-mana sorcery with Delve that lets you exile a card from your graveyard to pay for 1 mana of its casting cost. Often you'll delve away 3 to 5 cards and only pay 3 to 5 mana to draw 3 cards. I love this card because it can pay off huge late in the game after your graveyard is built up, sometimes getting you 3 cards for 1 mana, which is just insane. The next 3 cards are perfect for this deck because they not only draw you cards, but let you also put an additional land into play, which, guess what, draws even more cards. So Explore and Growth Spiral, both 2-mana sorceries that draw us a card and allow us to play another land, are great for early game to get ahead of our opponents. And finally is Urban Evolution, a 5-mana sorcery that draws us 3 cards as well as play an additional land, and it's just a massive payoff with Tatyova out. So with Tatyova being the centerpiece of this deck, it's important that we have a couple ways to protect her from our opponents. And first is Simic Charm. It's a blue-green instant that lets us give target creature +3/+3 until end of turn, or permanent we control gains hexproof until the end of turn, or return target creature to its owner's hand. With this, we can get Tatyova out of numerous situations to keep our value engine going. Second is Soul of New Phyrexia, a costly 6-mana 6/6 artifact creature avatar with trample. For 5 mana, permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. Or for 5 mana, exile Soul of New Phyrexia from your graveyard, permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. Typically, this would be too costly in most decks to run as protection, but since this deck is all about ramping more lands into play, I think its steep price is something we'll be happy to pay to keep our board intact. And lastly, there's good old Fog, a 1-green instant that prevents all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Although this does not directly protect Tatyova from our opponents, this deck will spend a considerable amount of the early game playing lands and building value that we'll take advantage of later in the game. A card like Fog will come in handy when we get pressured by aggressive decks early and can potentially save us from dying before our engine is set up. Next up is Landfall. These next set of cards, much like Tatyova, trigger when lands come into play. Cards like Rampaging Baloths, Spore Mound, and Zendikar's Royal will make tokens whenever a land comes into play. These cards help turn our value engine of turning lands into card draw, into board presence, and damage as well. These can easily get out of control and overrun our opponents. Cards like Grazing Gladeheart, Jaddy Offshoot, and Retreat to Kazandu all gain life every time we play a land, with Retreat to Kazandu giving us an additional utility of putting a 1/1 counter on a creature as well. Cards like Guardian of Tazim and Retreat to Coralhelm help control the battlefield. Guardian of Tazim is a 5-mana 4/5 Sphinx that, with flying, that lets you tap target creature an opponent controls when a land enters the battlefield. If that land is an island, though, that creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. This is great for keeping large singular threats at bay, or for simply lowering your opponent's defenses for some easy damage. Retreat to Coralhelm is a 3-mana enchantment that lets you tap or untap target creature, or scry 1 when you play land. Another great utility card to either control the battlefield or filter out your draws. The next 2 creatures are pretty fun. Baloth Woodcrasher is a 6-mana 4/4 beast that gets +4/+4 and trample until end of turn when you play a land. It's not uncommon that you'll be playing 3 lands in a turn, making this a 6-mana 12/12 with trample. Your opponents won't see it coming, and it will be hilarious. Lastly is Oran Reef Hydra, a 6-mana 5/5 Hydra with trample that gets +1/+1 counter whenever you play a land. If that land is a forest, put 2 1/1 counters on it instead. While not as explosive as Baloth Woodcrasher, Oran-Reef Hydra will incrementally become a massive threat on the table that your opponents will have to deal with or face getting wrecked. Now let's move on to some more of the fun stuff. Now, what will we do if we play nothing but ramp for the first 5 turns of the game? Oh, I don't know. How about pour all our mana into massive leviathans and sea creatures that will make life hell for our opponents? Now, this first set of creatures lets us dump all our unused mana into something dangerous and hard to stop. Inkwell Leviathan is a 9 mana 7/11 with Trample, Island Walk, and Shroud, meaning if one of our opponents plays blue, they probably won't want to anymore after this game. Having Trample alongside Island Walk makes all your attacks good, and having Shroud is just icing on the cake. Simic Sky Swallower is no different. A 7 mana 6/6 with Flying, Trample, and Shroud is going to wreak havoc on our opponent's life totals with little that can stop it. Lastly, Stormtide Leviathan is an 8 mana 8/8 with Island Walk that makes all lands islands in addition to their other types, and creatures without Flying or Island Walk can't attack. Not only does it make our opponent's lands islands, meaning they won't be able to block our 8/8, but it also shuts down decks that runs creatures with Flying too. Now, this card could outright win you the game if your opponents can't deal with it quickly. These next 2 creatures are only big threats, but they also help control our opponent's boards while setting up ours for huge plays. Scourge of Fleets is a 7 mana 6/6 that upon entering the battlefield returns each creature your opponents control with toughness X or less to its owner's hand, where X is the number of islands you control. A potential one-sided board wipe sounds pretty good to me. And we also have Slyn Voda the Rising Deep, an 8 mana 8/8 with Kicker 2 that upon entering the battlefield, if it was kicked, returns all creatures to our owner's hands except for Merfolk, Krakens, Leviathans, Octopuses, and Serpents. A major sub-theme of this deck is sea creatures, and this creature can also give us a one-sided board wipe effect that can open the door for victory that our opponents just won't see coming. These next 2 creatures may not be as big, but in the right circumstances can get huge. Scute Mob is a 1 green mana 1/1 with, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 5 or more lands, put 4 1/1 counters on it. If you play this card with 5+ lands already in play, then every future turn you take will give it 4 +1/+1 counters each time. This little innocent 1/1 could end up being a 9/9 real quick and force your opponents to take it out or die. Crash of Rhino Beetles is like Scute Mob's older, meaner brother. A 5 mana 5/5 with Trample that gets +10/+10 as long as you control 10 or more lands. This deck is going to pump out lands so fast, you're going to find yourself on turn 6 with 10+ lands in play. Playing an effective 15/15 with Trample for 5 mana on turn 6 is no joke. It's going to deal a ton of damage, and it just might win you the game. Now, we've talked about how we're going to get our engine up and running and what we're going to use for that, but we have to have things in place and cards to stop our opponent's game plans. So next, we're going to move into our single target removal. Now, with our commander being the focal piece of this deck and utilizing costly threats to force on our opponents, we need ways to keep them at bay while we set up our board. Now, these first 3 creatures help deal with pesky opponents early. Acidic Slime can destroy target artifact, enchantment, or land upon entering the battlefield, while Reclamation Sage, at a lesser cost of 3, destroys either a target artifact or enchantment when it enters the battlefield. Lastly, Trigon Predator is a 3 mana 2/3 with Flying that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it destroys target artifact or enchantment they control. Broken Bond is a 2 mana sorcery that destroys target artifact or enchantment, but also lets you put land from your hand into play as well. It's pretty nice synergy with our commander. Kasmina's Transmutation is a 2 mana enchantment aura. The enchanted creature loses all abilities and has base power and toughness 1/1. This is a great way to deal with someone's annoying commander because by not destroying it, you're not allowing them to recast it from the command zone. This card can seriously hurt decks without good enchantment removal and could just lock an opponent out of the game. Reality Shift has become a favorite of mine. For 2 mana, this instant exiles target creature but manifests the top card of their library as a 2/2. Having a way to deal with indestructible creatures is hard to come by, but this card offers it with little downside. And lastly is a commander staple, Beast Within, a 3-mana instant that can destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token in exchange though. This is an extremely flexible card that lets you deal with any permanent on the battlefield with little downsides so you can keep your opponents in check. Sometimes the board just gets out of control with your opponents threatening to win the game at any moment, and single target removal just won't do the trick. Don't worry, this deck is packed with 5 board wipes to make sure you're running the table. First is Engulf the Shore, a 4-mana instant that returns all creatures with toughness less than or equal to the number of islands you control to their owner's hands. If you time this right, you can bounce everything but our massive sea creatures and clear the board for a huge swing. Next is Flood of Tears, a 6-mana sorcery that turns all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. If you return 4 or more non-token permanents you control this way, you may put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. This helps reset the entire board, but leaving you with something left over and keeping your opponents at bay is amazing. Next is Whelming Wave, a 4-mana sorcery that returns all creatures to their owner's hands except for krakens, leviathans, octopuses, and serpents. As I said earlier, sea creatures are a sub-theme of this deck, and if you're positioned right with a couple of those big creatures out and cast this, you'll surely knock someone out. Next is Curse of the Swine, a 2 blue and X for a sorcery that exiles X target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller puts a 2/2 green-board creature token onto the battlefield. Again, exiling creatures is a permanent way to deal with your opponent's boards with very little downside. Our last board wipe is Nalia's Intervention, a 2 green and X for a sorcery that says choose one. Search your library for up to X land cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, or it deals twice X damage to each creature with flying. Now while this board wipe is limited to flying creatures, we aren't running many in the deck, so it will help take care of our opponents that utilize a lot of flyers. Plus, if there's no flying threat, we can fill our hand up with lands instead. And since our commander wants us to play more than 1 land a turn, I think we'll always want to see this card during a game. So now that we've gone through how the deck operates and how we deal with our opponents, we need to talk about how this deck wins. So the plan is to ramp out a ton of lands that will in turn draw us a ton of cards and gain a bunch of life. But how do we win? Well, apart from creating a token army with cards like Rampaging Balos or summoning massive creatures like Inkwell Leviathan, we may need more help to close a game out. So here we go. With our value engine able to create a dominating board with either large singular threats or many tokens, both Overrun and Overwhelming Stampede will help put us over the top and knock our opponents right out of the game. Overrun is a 5-mana sorcery that gives all our creatures +3/+3 and trample until end of turn. This is a nice anthem effect aimed at giving a massive token army the muscle to do some damage. And then we have Stampede, a 5-mana sorcery that gives your creatures trample and +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Remember that Crash of Rhino Beetles card? Yeah. A 15/15 with trample was already scary, but a 30/30 with trample? Even with just a couple small creatures on the board, as long as one of them has decent stats, this card will likely end the game right then and there. This is an amazing, powerful card, and you should just hope you're lucky enough to draw it each game. These next 2 cards are freaking hilarious. You know how you spent all game putting lands into play? How all those lands help generate tokens and massive sea creatures? Your opponents are used to dealing with those type of threats, and they likely will, but they'll never see this haymaker coming. The first is the worst of the 2, Rude Awakening, a 5-mana sorcery with Entwine 3 that says choose one. Untap all lands you control, or until end of turn, lands you control become 2/2 creatures that are still lands. So for 8 mana, you can untap all your lands you use that turn, they'll become 2/2s, and your opponent's life totals will disappear. Now you have to be really careful with this card, because by turning your lands into creatures, your opponents will be able to deal with them much easier. But if they can't, see ya. The next is an amazing card. Sylvan Awakening is a 3-mana sorcery with, until your next turn, all lands you control become 2/2 elemental creatures with reach, indestructible, and haste. They're still lands. Again, if you play this card and don't win, it can spell trouble for you. But your land creatures now have the benefit of being indestructible, making them much more difficult to deal with. Oftentimes, if you're in a position to play this card near the end of the game with your opponents tapped out, you will be crowned the winner and everyone will want to play your deck. Now, with this being a budget deck, I picked a 2-color commander for this purpose. Lands can be extremely expensive. The only non-basic land in this deck is Reliquary Tower, primarily to keep this deck as budget as possible. With a total of 41 lands, we'll end up running 23 forests and 17 islands to fill it out. You can feel free to add in any dual lands you see fit, but to keep it budget, this is what needs to be done. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech of Tatyova Benthic Druid for under $35. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content. One of my goals with this channel is to make fun decks for new players at a reasonable price point, and the deck list is in the notes. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you later.